It's time to write your congressman again. I'll be right back. 8 Democratic congressmen and 54 Republicans have joined together in introducing a welfare reform program that could save the taxpayers almost $2 billion. It will, if passed, probably save more. I learned in our own welfare reforms in California that our real savings were far greater than our estimates. Even more important, these reforms will also benefit the truly needy who must have our help. In California, in addition to saving the taxpayers $1 billion, we were able to increase the grants to the needy by an average of 43%. When we reformed welfare in California and halted an increase in caseload that was adding 40,000 people a month to the rolls, we did so by changes in state regulations and administrative rules. We could not, however, change the multitudinous federal regulations imposed on us by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in Washington. With reform, those regulations offer an even greater potential savings. The plan being offered to Congress is in effect an extension of the California plan, but involving those federal regulations. One major change would require able-bodied mothers on the Aid for Dependent Children program to work in return for their welfare grants at public or community work projects half-time, 80 hours a month. As one congressman put it, they get something, they give something. Now, there'll be terrific opposition to this, charges of slave labor and that welfare mothers should be in the home with their children. Well, let me answer that latter charge first. 40% of the American mothers of children under 18 years of age are working, and 1/3 of these have children under the age of 6. As for public work projects being slave labor, we were allowed to conduct an experiment in 35 California counties where able-bodied welfare recipients had to report for such work. In 1 year, we funneled 57,000 people from welfare through these work projects into private enterprise jobs. In 1969, the House Ways and Means Committee did a study in 11 cities and came to the conclusion that an increasing number of welfare recipients were people who had been induced by social workers to quit jobs and opt for welfare instead. It's time for welfare reform at the national level, and reform is not a new idea. In 1935, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act and announced, "We can now see the end of public assistance in America." Well, in 1962, John Fitzgerald Kennedy signed a welfare reform bill which he said would cost more to start with, but which would eventually reduce the rolls by training people for useful work by stressing, quote, self-support and simplifying welfare administration, unquote. In 1964, Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Economic Opportunity Act, the Poverty Program, and said, quote, "The days of the dole in our country are numbered," unquote. In the meantime, an executive in health, education, and welfare was telling the professionals in the department to think big and to plan big, and they did. While 3 presidents were making statements they believed were true, and our national population was increasing 11%, aid to dependent children increased 216%, and the overall welfare caseload more than doubled and its cost quadrupled. Now is the time to write your congressman in support of welfare reform. I'll tell you some more about welfare tomorrow. This is Ronald Reagan. Thanks for listening. Welfare reform at the federal level is overdue, and we can learn something from over 400 years of English history on the subject. I'll be right back. Yesterday, I spoke of the 62 congressmen, Democrats and Republicans, who are sponsoring federal welfare reform legislation. I suggested that they need our help. No right-thinking person questions our responsibility to lend less fortunate neighbors a hand. But we can't ignore any longer the harm we're doing to the very people we're trying to help. We can look to history for what might happen if we don't recognize what we're doing and where we're going. England embarked on its first welfare program in 1547. By the end of the 17th century, nearly 1/5 of the English nation was receiving aid at least part of the time. The mayor of San Francisco has just announced that 1 out of 4 in that city is on welfare. In England, the dole was often 3 times as much as the laborer could afford for himself and his family. By the end of the 18th century, at a place called Speenhamland, they decided that wages below a certain level should be supplemented according to the price of bread and the number of children in the family. Sound familiar? In the next 20 years, the cost of the program doubled and redoubled until it was 1/6 of the total national expenditure. Some local governments went bankrupt. That's what our mayors are trying about now. Labor was demoralized, riots and fires swept the countryside. In 1832, a royal commission was appointed to study the problem. At the end of 2 years, the commission reported the worker need not bestir himself to work. So they recommended that relief should not be made more attractive than the pay for the most menial of jobs. They said, "We do not believe that a country in which every man, whatever his conduct or character, is ensured a comfortable living, can retain its prosperity or even its civilization." In commenting on the social workers, they said, "Their feelings are all on one side. Their pity for the pauper excludes any for the taxpayer." They saw the problem as, quote, "how to afford the people relief without injury to their diligence or their providence," unquote. History does repeat itself. In 1969, the House Ways and Means Committee discovered the highest factor determining the size of the caseload was the size of the grant. When grant levels are too high, there is no incentive to work. Not only have we accepted the questionable premise that welfare is a right, we've carried that to the extreme of believing certain types of jobs are more disgraceful than welfare. It's time to disabuse ourselves of the idea that any job is somehow disgraceful or dishonorable. Some time back, a Rutgers University professor discovered what that English Royal Commission learned 150 years ago. He said, "The billions of dollars that are being spent on the urban poor by all levels of government go mainly to support a growing welfare bureaucracy, youth workers, clerks, supervisors, key punchers, and people's lawyers. The bureaucracy is sustained by the plight of the poor, the threat of the poor, the misery of the poor, but it yields little in the way of loaves and fishes to the poor. When the old programs demonstrably fail, they are rebaptized and refunded," unquote. 62 congressmen are proposing a way to change this. They need your help and your letters. This is Ronald Reagan. Thanks for listening. Should our judgment of welfare be based only on whether it raises the standard of living for recipients, or should we also consider what it does to the character of the people who participate? I'll be right back. For the last 2 days, I've been talking about welfare and the need to correct some of the costly, cumbersome, bureaucratic nonsense that has taken it far afield from its original purpose. Today, I'd like to touch on what it may be doing to the spirit and character of our people. Knowing how easy it is to be attacked as heartless and unfeeling, let me say a few things about my own position. First of all, I believe in our responsibility to help those who, for whatever reason, are unable to provide for themselves and their families. Right now, I believe we could do more for the truly needy if we weren't spread too thin, providing for some who are just greedy. Milton Friedman, the noted economist, once said, "When you start paying people to be poor, you wind up with an awful lot of poor people." From my own experience, I'm convinced that most welfare recipients are unhappy being on welfare, and they'd much rather be self-sustaining and self-respecting. I'm also sure, however, that encouraged by some professional welfarists, many lose their desire to leave welfare and begin accepting it as a way of life, indeed a career in itself. When this happens, we're destroying human beings, not salvaging them. There's a so-called National Welfare Rights Organization dedicated to demanding a voice in how much of a worker's earnings must be shared with them. A few years ago, a Mrs. Beulah Sanders, representing this organization before the House Ways and Means Committee, said, "Everyone in this country has a right to share the wealth. The money has gone into the pockets of the middle class, and if we don't get our share, we're going to disrupt this state, this country, and this capital." Federal officials have habitually said fraud in welfare was less than 1%. But Dr. Richard Nathan, while a deputy to the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, said, "Our problem is we can't even detect fraud." Former Congressman Bill Shirley of Iowa once told his colleagues, "Take the capital of the strongest, wealthiest, most freedom-loving country in history. Give it an unemployment rate of only 2%, but 1 out of 5 on welfare. The median income is $10,500, yet federal aid per capita is 6 times as much as it is for the citizens of Iowa. Then set up a federally funded consumer complaint department in a model city project, and what is the #1 complaint of these deprived people? Jobs? Housing? Crime? Their color TV sets don't work properly." In 1968, CORE, the Committee on Racial Equality, told us why we should be supporting the present move in Congress to reform welfare. They said, "Handouts are demeaning. They do violence to a man, strip him of his dignity, and breed in him a hatred of the total system. Poor men want the same as the rest of us. They want to be independent. They want jobs and control over their own destiny. Welfare," they said, "is no answer. We seek to harness the creative energy of private enterprise to achieve a solution to America's crisis. We look to American independence of spirit to recognize opportunity and to take advantage of it." It's happened in the past. It can happen again. The end of Cora's quote. This is Ronald Reagan. Thanks for listening.